Ever been out in the wilderness, miles away from civilization, and suddenly felt watched? Like something just outside your vision is waiting, silent, patient. Some hikers make it out with nothing more than a creeping sense of unease. Others aren't so lucky. Tonight we're diving into real, terrifying hiking stories. First-hand accounts of people who encountered something in the woods that defies explanation. From eerie figures appearing in the mist to voices calling your name when no one is there, these stories will make you think twice before stepping off the beaten path. But before we start, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps more than you know. And if you love unsettling, spine-chilling stories, subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss a night of horror. Now, let's step into the darkness together. Just don't look back. I've always loved hiking alone. There's something about the silence of the woods, the crispness of the air, the way the trees seem to breathe around you. It's the only place I've ever felt truly at peace. That was until the pines. The trail wasn't on any map. I'd only heard about it through whispers, half warnings, half dares. Don't go too deep, people would say, their voices low, like they feared the trees could hear them. The deeper you go, the harder it is to leave. It was exactly the kind of challenge I couldn't resist. I started my hike early, the morning sun spilling golden light through the towering pines. The first few miles were stunning, uncharted beauty, untouched by crowds. But as I ventured deeper, the trail became wrong. The silence was too thick. Birds had stopped singing. The wind had died. The trees, packed too closely together, blocked out more and more of the sky. My GPS flickered and died, leaving me with only my instincts and a growing unease. Then came the footsteps. They weren't mine. I stopped, listened. My breath hung in the still air, tap, 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 soft, deliberate. Not the rustling of an animal, not the crunch of a fellow hiker. Someone, something was walking, pacing, just out of sight. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. No answer. I picked up my pace. Whatever was in those woods, it was watching me. Just when panic began clawing at my ribs, I saw it. A cabin, deep in the forest where no structure should be. It looked ancient, its wooden frame sagging with rot, windows smeared with something dark. The door stood slightly open, as if inviting me in. My every instinct screamed to keep moving. But my curiosity, stupid, reckless curiosity, made me step forward. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Claw marks gouged the walls. The furniture was broken, but something had been living there. Bones littered the floor, human bones. Then I saw it. In the farthest corner, its body half hidden in shadow. A figure too tall, too thin, its joints bent at unnatural angles. Its head twitched, once, twice, before locking onto me. And then it smiled. I ran, harder than I've ever run in my life. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but behind me it followed. No footsteps, just shifting shadows, moving faster than anything should. Branches snapped around me, the air grew colder, it was closing in. I saw my car through the trees, almost there, almost safe, and then a whisper in my ear. Don't go too deep. I fell forward, tumbling onto the dirt. My fingers clawed at the ground, scrambling to my feet. When I turned back, it was gone. I don't know how I made it home. I don't remember the drive, but for weeks I felt it. The sensation of being watched, of something just behind me, just out of sight. I tried to look up the pines later, find records of the land, the cabin, anything. There was nothing. No mention of a hidden trail. No reports of missing hikers. It was as if the pines had swallowed them whole. But sometimes late at night, I swear I still hear it. The footsteps, the whisper, and the thing that smiled. The Appalachian Trail is a vast, winding path through some of the most remote stretches of wilderness in the United States. Many hikers take to its trails seeking solitude, adventure, or a break from the pressures of everyday life. But solitude can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes you're not as alone as you think. It was early October when Daniel set out on his solo trek. The trees were painted in fiery reds and deep golds, and the crisp autumn air was invigorating. He had spent months preparing for this trip, researching routes, packing just enough supplies to keep his pack light, and familiarizing himself with the landmarks that would guide his way. He prided himself on being an experienced hiker, someone who could handle the isolation, the unpredictability of the wilderness. 3 days into the hike, he had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The mornings were spent navigating winding trails, the afternoons basking in the beauty of untouched nature, and the evenings cooking by the fire beneath the brilliant canopy of stars. But on the fourth night, something changed. He had just finished eating when he heard a noise, a rustling, just beyond the tree line. At first, he dismissed it as a small animal foraging in the underbrush, but then came the sound of deliberate footsteps, slow, heavy, measured. The kind of steps made by something or someone large. Daniel held his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. He reached for his flashlight and shone it toward the sound. Nothing. Just the dense, unbroken wall of trees. Still, the feeling of being watched crept into his bones, gnawing at the edges of his rationality. He tried to shake it off, telling himself that fear had a way of distorting the mind. He doused his fire, zipped himself into his tent, and forced himself to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time he drifted off, he was jolted awake by the sensation of movement outside. The faintest whispers of fabric brushing against something. The snap of twigs beneath unseen weight. At one point, he swore he heard breathing, deep, ragged, just inches from the thin material of his tent. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light crept through the trees, Daniel unzipped his tent and stepped outside, scanning his campsite. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints, no signs of anything unusual. He laughed at himself, shaking off the paranoia that had gripped him so fiercely the night before. It was probably just exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Still, he decided to push forward at a quicker pace, eager to put distance between himself and whatever had unsettled him. The day passed uneventfully, and as the sun began to sink beneath the horizon, he found a suitable spot to set up camp. But as he gathered wood for his fire, a chilling realization made his stomach drop. His campsite was identical to the one from the night before. The same natural clearing, the same gnarled oak tree leaning over a smooth rock formation. He knew he had been walking in a straight line all day. He had checked his map, his compass, but somehow he had ended up back where he started. A sharp snap of a branch made him whip around. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible between the trees. Tall, gaunt, wrapped in tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by shadow, but he could see the glint of eyes reflecting the dying light of day. Panic surged through Daniel's veins. He grabbed his pack, slung it over his shoulder, and bolted. His lungs burned as he sprinted through the thick forest, branches slashing at his arms and legs. The sound of footsteps followed, but they weren't running. They were walking, unhurried, as if they knew he couldn't escape. He didn't stop until he reached a small cave nestled in the side of a rocky outcrop. He scrambled inside, pressing himself against the cool stone. struggling to control his ragged breathing. Hours passed in the suffocating darkness. His only company was the distant hoot of an owl and the whisper of wind through the trees. Then, a new sound. Software insidious. A wet, dragging noise coming from the cave's entrance. He turned his head ever so slightly, peering into the inky blackness. A shape moved just beyond the threshold. It crouched low, its body unnaturally twisted, its head tilted at an impossible angle. And then it spoke, a whisper, just one word. Lost. Daniel never returned from that hike. Search teams found his abandoned campsite, his gear scattered as if he had left in a hurry. But of Daniel himself, there was no trace. Some say he simply got disoriented and succumbed to the elements. Others claim the forest has its own way of keeping those who wander too far. And if you ever find yourself hiking alone in the Appalachian wilderness, listen closely. When the wind dies down and the night is at its darkest, you might hear it too. A whisper in the trees. Lost. The wind howled like a living thing tearing through the Ural Mountains with an unrelenting, icy grip. It was February 1959, and 9 experienced hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute had embarked on an expedition to reach Otorten, a remote and treacherous peak. Led by Igor Dyatlov, they were young, fearless, and well prepared for the brutal Siberian cold. But none of them would ever return. What happened in the frozen wilderness of Dyatlov Pass remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries of all time. When rescuers finally reached their campsite weeks later, they were met with a scene of pure terror, one that defied all logic and reason. The tent stood half buried in the snow, but something was terribly wrong. It hadn't been unzipped or collapsed from the weight of snowfall. It had been slashed open from the inside, as if the hikers had desperately fled into the freezing night, running from something unseen, something unspeakable. Their tracks led away from the tent in utter chaos. Some wore only socks. Others were barefoot, no coats, no gloves. Just the raw, unfiltered terror of people who had no time to think, only react. The tracks stretched toward the tree line, where the first bodies were found. 2 of the hikers lay beneath a gnarled cedar tree, their hands clawed and bloodied, as if they had tried to climb in a desperate bid to escape something lurking below. Their bodies were frozen solid, their expressions locked in grotesque masks of agony. Between them, remnants of a fire, their final feeble attempt to stave off the brutal cold. But the cold hadn't killed them. Not entirely. The searchers pressed on, following the faint traces left in the snow. 3 more bodies were found, scattered between the tree line and the tent, positioned as if they had been trying to crawl back to safety, back to anything that could protect them from what was out there. But the horror didn't end there. It took more time to find the remaining 4. They had been buried beneath 4 meters of compacted snow, hidden deep in a ravine. And when they were uncovered, it became clear that something beyond nature, had claimed them. Their injuries defied explanation. 1 had a crushed skull. 2 had shattered ribs, not broken, shattered, as though they had been struck by an inhuman force. Yet eerily, there were no external wounds, no bruises, no signs of an impact. It was as if something had exploded inside them. And then there was her. 1 hiker, a young woman, was missing her tongue. Her eyes were gone. The soft tissue of her face had been stripped away with surgical precision. There was no sign of an animal attack, no ragged tearing, just a smooth, unnatural absence. Theories ran wild. An avalanche? But the bodies weren't found in positions consistent with being buried alive. Hypothermia-induced madness? That wouldn't explain the massive internal injuries. Military testing. Some of the hikers' clothing contained trace amounts of radiation. Then there were the rumors, the stories whispered by the native Mansi people. They had long called the area Kholat Syakhl, the Mountain of the Dead. They spoke of spirits, of something ancient that lurked beyond human understanding. The most disturbing accounts came from reports of glowing orbs in the sky on the night of the hikers' disappearance. Strange lights moving in patterns no aircraft could replicate. Some believed they had stumbled upon something they were never meant to see. The Soviet authorities closed the case with an eerie and unsatisfying conclusion. A compelling natural force. No real answers. No justice for the dead. The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of modern times. And whatever happened that night in the mountains, one thing is certain. The 9 hikers saw something, and it saw them too. The forest had always been our place. Me and Jason, best friends since middle school, spent countless weekends exploring trails, chasing the thrill of the unknown. The deeper we went, the more we felt like we were leaving the world behind. No traffic, no buzzing phones, just the crunch of leaves underfoot and the whisper of the wind through the canopy. That weekend, we set out on a trail neither of us had tried before. It was an unmarked path Jason had found online, buried deep in a forum filled with cryptic warnings and half-forgotten legends. I remember laughing when he showed me. People love to make up creepy stories about the woods, I said. Jason didn't laugh back. Just makes it more fun, he muttered. We started hiking in the late afternoon, the golden sun filtering through skeletal branches. The deeper we went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just the two of us and our footsteps. Something about it felt off, like the trees were watching. Then Jason changed. At first, it was subtle. He walked faster, barely acknowledging me when I spoke. His usual easygoing nature had been replaced with something else, something rigid, almost mechanical. He'd stare straight ahead as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "Jason, man, slow down," I called. He didn't respond. A sinking feeling clawed its way into my stomach. I reached out to grab his shoulder, just a friendly nudge, a reminder that I was still there. Jason flinched away, his breath ragged. "We have to get to the lake," he muttered. "They're waiting." I froze. Who's waiting? No answer. The trail led us deeper into the woods, where the trees grew twisted and gnarled. Shadows stretched long in the dimming light, taking on unfamiliar shapes. Jason moved faster now, almost running. And then we saw it. A lake. It shouldn't have been there. We hadn't crossed any streams, and the maps hadn't shown water anywhere near our trail. But there it was. A vast, still body of water, perfectly circular, reflecting the sky in eerie stillness. No ripples, no signs of life. And then I saw them. Figures standing waist-deep in the lake. Men, women, expressionless, unmoving. Their clothes hung off them in wet, heavy folds. They stared at us, their eyes black pits in the dimming light. A primal, unspoken dread wrapped itself around my spine, squeezing the air from my lungs. Jason stepped forward. "Jason, don't," I whispered, grabbing his arm. He turned to look at me, and I swear for just a second his face wasn't his anymore. His eyes were too wide, his mouth slightly open, as if hearing something I couldn't. Then, with a single unnatural jerk, he collapsed into the water. The figures pulled him in. I screamed his name, but he didn't fight, didn't struggle. The last thing I saw was his face sinking beneath the surface, his mouth opening in a silent gasp. And then he was gone. The figures, they disappeared with him. The lake was empty again. I don't remember running, but somehow I made it back to my car, lungs burning, throat raw from screaming his name. I told the police everything. They searched for days. No body. No footprints near the water. No evidence Jason had ever been there. But I know what I saw, and I know that lake wasn't on any map. Jason's parents refused to speak to me after that. Maybe they thought I was lying. Maybe they just couldn't face the truth. But late at night, when sleep won't come, I find myself thinking about his last words. They're waiting. I wonder how many others they've taken. And I wonder when they'll come back for me. The crisp mountain air filled Maria Diana's lungs as she hiked through Romania's Bucegi Mountains, a breathtaking but rugged stretch of the Carpathians. At just 19 years old, she was young, adventurous, and eager to explore nature's untouched beauty. Her boyfriend, Alex, walked beside her, occasionally snapping pictures of the towering peaks and the winding trail ahead. They had set out early that morning, excited for what was supposed to be an unforgettable day. The Bucegi Mountains held a certain mystique. Whispers of strange occurrences and eerie disappearances had long surrounded the region. But Maria wasn't the kind to believe in ghost stories or legends. To her, this was simply a place of raw, untamed wilderness, one that demanded respect but held no supernatural threats. As they climbed higher, the dense pine forest began to thin, revealing sweeping vistas of the valley below. The golden sunlight trickled through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. Everything felt peaceful, too peaceful. The trail was quieter than expected. Normally, they would have passed other hikers by now, but the mountain seemed eerily deserted. Then the silence was broken by something chilling. A low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. Maria and Alex froze. The sound wasn't distant. It was close. Too close. Alex scanned the tree line, his heart pounding in his chest. That was a bear, no doubt about it. The Bucegi Mountains were home to one of the largest bear populations in Europe, but attacks were rare. Maria slowly reached for her phone. Her hands trembled as she dialed emergency services. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the speaker. "Stay calm, don't run, back away slowly." But then, the branches snapped, and the bear stepped onto the trail. It was massive, at least 600 pounds, its fur a dark, shaggy brown, eyes locked onto them with a terrifying intensity. This wasn't normal bear behavior. It wasn't sniffing for food, wasn't retreating. It was hunting. Maria took a slow step back, keeping her voice calm. "We're going to be okay," she whispered to Alex. But then the bear lunged. Maria screamed as the beast closed the distance in seconds. Her phone clattered to the ground, the call still active as she was yanked off her feet. The bear's claws ripped through fabric, through skin. Alex tried to grab her, but it was too late. The bear was dragging her off the trail. She fought, kicking, screaming, but it was too strong. In seconds, she was pulled toward the edge of a steep drop, a 400-foot sheer cliff. Her screams echoed through the valley. Then, silence. Alex stood there, paralyzed, numb. He barely registered the sound of sirens in the distance. The emergency operator had heard everything. Rescuers arrived, their faces pale as they scanned the scene. It took hours to reach Maria's body at the base of the cliff, but she wasn't alone. The bear was still there, guarding her remains. Wildlife officers had no choice. The bear was euthanized on the spot. In the days that followed, questions swirled. Why had the bear attacked so viciously? Why had it refused to leave Maria even after death? Some experts speculated illness, possibly rabies. Others whispered about something darker. One thing was certain. The Bucegi Mountains had claimed another life, and Maria's final, desperate screams would haunt the valley forever. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. After months of stress at work, Ethan, an experienced hiker, decided to clear his mind with a solo trek through the secluded backcountry of Oregon's Tillamook Forest. The plan was simple, a 2-day hike with a quiet night of camping beneath the towering evergreens. Ethan had done trips like this before. He knew the woods, the trails, the survival skills. He prided himself on being level-headed, never spooked by ghost stories or strange noises in the night. But this trip would test him in ways he never expected. By the time the sun began to set, Ethan had set up camp deep within the forest, miles away from the nearest road. He built a fire, made a quick meal, and settled in to enjoy the solitude. The crackling flames and distant hoots of owls filled the air. Everything was perfect, until he saw the figure. At first it was nothing, a shift in the treetops, the kind of movement easily dismissed as wind or wildlife. But as he turned his head, he caught sight of something that didn't belong. Between the trees, barely visible in the dimming light, stood a person. They were too far to make out details, but something was immediately off. The figure was completely still, not walking, not shifting their weight, just standing, watching. Ethan's first thought was that it was another hiker, maybe lost or in need of help. But as he squinted through the flickering firelight, a wave of unease settled over him. The person was barefoot. They wore tattered clothing, their stance unnaturally rigid, almost as if they weren't breathing. Even from a distance, Ethan could feel their presence, silent, waiting. He called out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. The figure remained motionless. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the trees, but the instant the beam touched them, they moved. Not toward him, not away, just deeper into the forest. Ethan felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The rational part of his brain tried to explain it. A lost hiker, a local drifter, maybe even just a trick of the light. But deep down, something told him to stay alert. He spent the next hour tending the fire, trying to shake the unease, convincing himself that he was overreacting. Then he heard the whispering. It wasn't wind, it wasn't an animal. It was human. Faint voices just beyond the tree line, too hushed to make out the words. Ethan's stomach turned. He grabbed his knife and flashlight, scanning the darkness. But the voices stopped the moment the light touched the trees. Total silence. For the first time in his life, Ethan considered breaking his own rule, packing up and leaving in the middle of the night. But as he sat there, paralyzed between reason and fear, he saw something even worse. A few feet beyond the tree line, barely illuminated by the dying fire, stood the figure again. But now Ethan could see their face. It was a man, if you could still call it that. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his eyes sunken and hollow. And he was smiling. Not a friendly smile. Not an apologetic, "Oh, I was just lost" smile. A wide-stretched, unnatural grin. And then, just as Ethan's breath caught in his throat, the man started walking toward him. No words, no change in expression. Just slow, deliberate steps, barefoot against the cold earth. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed his gear, threw dirt over the fire, and bolted. He didn't care about the trail. He didn't care about injuries. He just ran. The footsteps followed, not sprinting, not even running, but steady, like the man knew exactly where Ethan was headed. Ethan ran for what felt like hours, blindly crashing through the underbrush until he saw the one thing that made his heart nearly burst with relief: his car. It was still there, parked at the trailhead, waiting for him like a beacon of safety. He fumbled with his keys, yanked the door open, and threw himself inside. As he turned the ignition, his headlights flared to life, illuminating the forest behind him. There, at the edge of the trees, stood the man, still barefoot, still grinning. But now he was waving. Ethan never went back to that trail. He told a few close friends, but they all had the same response. Must have been some backwoods squatter, or you were just sleep-deprived, man. But a few weeks later, something made his blood run cold. A news report surfaced. A prisoner had escaped from a mental institution a few miles from the Tillamook forest. The description: a tall, barefoot man with sunken eyes and a wide grin. The police never caught him, and Ethan never went hiking alone again. Somewhere out there in the trees, something still waits, watching, smiling. Maybe he's still in the forest, waiting for another unsuspecting hiker to venture too far from the trail. Or worse, maybe he's already found his way back to civilization. Would you know if he was watching you?